Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of our attendees from all over the world. I'm so sorry for the short delay that we had in starting this, but today we have a very important topic to discuss. Today's panel is on the global economic crisis and gender equality. My name is Kat Usita. I am Deputy Head of Research at OMFIF, and this is a topic that's very important to us. For many years, OMFIF has been doing research on the area of gender diversity in the financial sector, specifically in the underrepresentation of women in different parts of finance. And this panel that we're going to have today is also part of a broader program we have just launched this year, the Sustainable Policy Institute, where we deal with different issues and themes related to sustainable finance. And gender diversity is, of course, one part of it that we would like to draw attention to today. So in today's discussion, we're going to talk about how the economic fallout from COVID-19 is affecting men and women differently. We're also going to cover how different organizations have been affected and how the pandemic might be worsening inequalities in the workplace that had already been existing before. I am so pleased to say that today's panel is really an excellent roster of speakers. We have selected them because they have done some work in this field, and also they belong to institutions that believe strongly in the cause of gender equality and how we need to promote diversity and inclusion within our organizations, but also in the wider communities that we serve. So to begin, I am going to ask each of our panelists to give a few comments, their general observations on the topic of how women are being affected by the crisis. And I will, as I go through them one by one, I will also introduce them. And so excited again, thank you to our panelists for being here today. I think I will begin with Ratna Sahai, Deputy Director of the Monetary and Capital Markets Department at the International Monetary Fund. Ratna, the topic of crises and policy response, this is something that's not new to you. You do a lot of work on that in the IMF, and you have also done plenty of research on the important issue of access to financial services. Can you maybe describe some of the challenges that women might be facing during this time in terms of access to financial services and how the pandemic is impacting that?
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you are. Kat, thank you very much for the nice introduction. I really want to thank OMFIF and Kat for inviting me. It's a really important topic. So let me tell you that, of course, we've been monitoring. I belong to an organization which has 190 member countries, so we are closely keeping track of the developments there. So let me tell you what we are seeing. I think, as many of you might be aware, the pandemic has already had a pretty regressive impact on gender equality. Women have lost jobs at a disproportionately higher rate than their male counterparts. So I would say about close to 1 million women, and that was maybe even a few months ago, have lost their job. And the majority of them worked in temporary and part-time positions and left the labor force. So I'm sorry to see that with no policy action, this trend will wipe out all the progress we've made in the last decade towards gender equality. And what we had seen is a lot of catch-up. So there are several reasons why women are affected more. They tend to work in social sectors, physical face-to-face interaction. They tend to operate more in the informal sector, and they also tend to do more unpaid than men. And then during the COVID, they're facing other special challenges. So there has been a rapid adoption of digital financial services, which is accelerating during COVID. And even though it has the potential to really close gender gaps, cross-country data indicate that women on average have a lower chance of owning a mobile phone or even a traditional financial account. They have less access to internet. They are less educated. They are poorer and less likely, as it is, to be in the labor force relative to men. They are also facing violence or rejection by their own families during the COVID crisis. And now they are bearing the brunt of family care responsibilities, which is resulting from the shutdown measures. In many countries, they are the main source of livelihood. So for a number of factors, the COVID crisis has actually hit them pretty hard. Thank you.
Thank you, Ratna. That's a really broad view. You touched on several aspects: employment, access to services. I'm now going to move on to Deputy Governor Fernanda Necchio of the Banco Central do Brasil. Welcome, Deputy Governor, and thank you for joining our panel. So you, as part of your job as central banker, you keep a close eye on how the crisis is affecting different sectors of society. How has the pandemic affected women in Brazil? What does the data tell us? What sort of trends are you observing?
Hello, thanks for the invitation for being here. I'm sorry that I was a little bit late, but I had a lot of technical problems, but you know, everything's solved and I think you can hear me well now. So things are working. So I think a lot of what I have to say about that reflects what Ratna just told us. You know, women were disproportionately affected by COVID in Brazil as well. This, I think it's going to be true in many countries. But, you know, the statistics that we have so far show that the unemployment rate raised twice as much for them relative to men. So I think we can think about some reasons for that. First, you know, I think women in Brazil, at least in the labor market here, work a larger share of women working in the service sector or sectors that are contact intensive. And so, you know, those are disproportionately affected by COVID-19. It is also true that a significant share of women work in the informal sector in Brazil, which is a challenge for emerging economies. And the informal sector was also disproportionately affected. And we also see in the statistics that, you know, this disproportionate increase in the unemployment rate for women was more concentrated in the north and northeast of Brazil, which tends to be areas where you have lower income households. So you do see it's almost like a perfect storm, and women can be very damaged by those factors. So I think in terms of I think the other type of statistics that we've seen recently that are interesting to mention is that in Brazil, there has been a survey collecting information about household chores. And you see also that women had the number of hours in household chores increasing relative to men since the pandemic hit the economy. So putting all that together, I think the type of statistics that we are seeing now for Brazil go very much in line with what Ratna was telling us about what is happening worldwide.
That's a very interesting point, the statistics that you have on the hours of household chores, because I think that's something we've all observed in one way or another in our own homes or with our friends or colleagues, anecdotally, but it would be good to see what those numbers might look like. So Fernanda, you talked about the experience in Brazil. I'm going to move on to another one of our panelists, Qatar Ed Damani of Barings. As Managing Director for Emerging Markets and Sovereign Debt, this discussion of what's happening in emerging markets must be not new to you, and I'm sure you follow closely what's going on in the markets that you cover. Perhaps you could give us some insight on how women could be experiencing the crisis differently depending on the economic environment that they're in.
Yes, thank you so much, Kat. Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here today with you. So I'm not a development policy expert, but I observe the markets that we look at very closely, and I think the observation by both Ratna and Fernanda underline two two important things. The first one is that any shocks, here it's a major shock, it's a pandemic, but any shocks tend to magnify existing inequalities. And so if, for instance, women are a category that suffer the most from poverty or from health inequalities or from education inequalities or from participation in the labor market that is lower or of lower quality, in that case, of course, the pandemic will affect them more. And the second thing, of course, is that there is a risk that this pandemic creates even more inequalities going forward. For instance, if you observe the channel of education, if you have, because of inequalities of access to remote education or the difference that we were mentioning before inside the household of either chores or inequalities or the difference, especially in emerging countries, between access to going to school or remote teaching. In that case, it might lead to more dropouts. It might have much longer lasting consequences on the potential of all these little girls and therefore women in the future. So in general, we can see that the shocks are likely to affect more women because of the existing inequalities. And of course, the problem is that the governments also are not the same, are not equipped in the same way to respond to the pandemics. So for instance, we have seen some governments expand the support fiscally or in monetary policy or in various ways to their populations in terms of social support, but the governments are not equipped in the same way. They don't have the same financial resources. The IMF has provided a number of financial support facilities, rapid financing to a number of countries, but countries do not have the same resources, and therefore here is the same. The poorer countries or the countries that are likely to be most affected have the least financing resources to address, this social impact, in particular on women. So that is what we are seeing, and therefore I think that continued support by the international financial communities, either through international donors or all the actors in the international financial sphere, is very important for these developing countries to muddle through the whole crisis.
Thank you, Kautar. That's really an interesting point. I mean, in the same way that the crisis is affecting every household differently, every part of a country differently, every government also has a different capacity to implement supporting mechanisms. And we'll get to all of that in a bit. But I would first like to welcome our fourth panelist, Gina Omolon from Mazars. Gina, you are a partner in Mazars, and like many of us here today, you have to balance your responsibilities at work alongside your own duties in your household with your family. Can you give us your own observations, whether that's from your own experience or what you're seeing around you?
Thank you, Kat. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. And thank you for the opportunity to engage in this dialogue. I am hearing from my fellow panelists a consistent theme. I think we are all in agreement that the pandemic that we're facing right now is an issue that disproportionately impacts women, right? Although I can still say that when the pandemic started, we were all locked up in our room, whether you're a man, a woman, a child, or elderly, we were all in this together without our usual support systems, right? But if we really look at it with a gender lens, we can see the disproportionate effect on women. In the US, a research published by the McKinsey Group and Lean In organizations that they published this year, where they surveyed more than 300 companies in the US and Canada, and also more than 40,000 employees, it revealed that 1 in 4 women are considering downsizing their careers or leaving the workforce as a result of this crisis. I would not have believed that if I heard that in January this year, right? And the key challenges that we are seeing, and we've been hearing also around, and it's really the anxiety, right, over layoffs and furloughs, the burnout that people are experiencing due to the various responsibilities, their workplace responsibilities and expectations, as well as the responsibilities at home with childcare and homeschooling. And then there's this physical and mental health issues that we're all seeing as well. Now, even before the pandemic, the women already have been experiencing the heavier burden. It's just the norms in our society where women are historically more likely than men to take on these caring roles. Think about the mothers, your aunts, and the women in your life, who after working, they would look after the kids or maybe bring the aging parent to the doctor. And also on the practicality side, more women are still earning less than their male counterparts. So, when this pandemic hits, it is expected that they are to be more flexible than their counterparts when decisions need to be made about who should stop working to take care of their family. So as mentioned by Qatar, I totally agree. This pandemic has magnified this existing inequality in our society. In Mazars, when we checked in with our, some of our men partners in the firm and asked them about how their homeschooling is going, because everybody is pretty much in the same boat. Interestingly enough, most of them said, "Oh, my wife does that," right? So when we all look around us, we see similar trends, and I hope in this panel we can tackle some of those issues and talk about some solutions.
Yep, that's exactly what we're going to do next. Thank you, Gina. Those are some very important points. And I should also mention that I'm sure we have a lot of individuals from Mazars and Barings who have dialed in. We saw it in the attendee list. This is clearly an issue that's important to both the organizations. Same, of course, with the IMF and the Central Bank of Brazil. So I will now pivot to the solution side of the discussion. So we've identified a lot of trends, we've identified a lot of problems that we've seen were worsened because of the pandemic. So in a second, let's start talking about what solutions should we be exploring. But before I do that, I would like to remind the audience that this is an interactive discussion, or at least we would like it very much to be. So please feel free to drop in your questions in the little chat box that you have there on the lower right hand of your screen, and I will field them to our panelists. So speaking about solutions, first maybe let's discuss it from a macro level in terms of what governments or what the public sector can do. So I should probably address this question to Fernanda and Ratna. Fernanda, you work in the central bank. What do you think governments should do to ensure that policy responses are inclusive and aligned with gender equality goals?
So this is a very interesting question. I think the first thing I think to think about is that policies should be better targeted to the challenges that we're going to face, in whatever response to shock that we have, right? So I think I can talk a little bit about the experience at the central bank, and then I can go back to the COVID and use it as an example to the type of policies that governments can have to try to better target and better reach minorities when facing a shock. Well, at the central bank, we've had, a very holistic approach to integrating and make sure that we have a safe and productive environment for minorities, women, for example. Over time we have had several events and workshops in trying to bring awareness and talk a lot about how we want to have a safe environment to foster diversity and how to guarantee that we have women included in the discussions and in the several layers of the administration and the work at the central bank. We actually this week have been working on a week to discuss financial literacy, which is something that it's not targeted internally, but targeted to the general public in Brazil, This is, I think, is a very important topic, particularly because, you know, statistics show that some women are left behind or even outside the financial sector. So we have been in a campaign to promoting financial literacy in Brazil. And this is something that the Central Bank of Brazil has been very keen on and working very much. I can talk later about also initiatives that we have been having on the sustainability agenda. And by sustainability, we have been talking about mitigating social and environmental risks. And a lot of emphasis have been put on the environmental risks, but social is also key there, and it gets exactly into the point of guaranteeing that we have a safe and an inclusive work environment. So I think policies that go into that direction go straight into the mandates of central banks, and that's something that we should continue to work on. So now that's kind of like talking about a little bit policies within the central bank framework. Now, your question was more targeting governments and what they can do in terms of policies. I think, you know, better targeting policies is the way to go. For example, in the case of COVID, Brazil implemented one of the largest income transfer programs in the world to support families during the lockdown or the restricted mobility period. This program was rolled out in April, and it reached, you know, 67 million beneficiaries in Brazil. Interestingly, in this program, there was some heterogeneity in the amount of transfer the households would receive, and households headed by women received actually higher transfers than households headed by men. And that was something that, you know, was embedded in the program and trying to, I think the objective was to go into the targeting objective that I mentioned before, and taking into account the different needs that poor households have depending on who is the head of the household, right? So I think this is one example that would be a way of better targeting social policies in response to a crisis, which was what we had now with COVID-19. Now, I think in general terms, so first I talked about the central bank. Now, you know, I gave an example about the government, but I think we can think about in general what we have been hearing from all other, you know, from other countries and internally as well, is that there is a demand for a recovery from COVID that is more sustainable and inclusive. And the inclusion part, it goes straight into the including minorities and poor households, right? So there is I think the pandemic, if there is anything positive about it, it raised a discussion about sustainability and the awareness about the need for inclusion with concerns related to minorities, women, and other groups. So many countries right now are discussing basic income programs and constructing green-friendly agendas, and those are, you know, coming as a response to the crisis. But I think they can very much so contribute to this discussion about having better targeted policies that could foster the inclusion of women in the economy.
Excellent, Fernanda. That's very useful. Indeed, targeting, policy targeting is very important across all levels, whether you're approaching it from the side of the government or as a central bank, or even within your own organization. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I'll move on now to Ratna. Ratna, you're not in the public sector, but you do work a lot with government. So maybe you can give us some perspective there.
Thanks, Kat. I mean, let me just say that it was so encouraging to hear what Fernanda had to say, what Brazil is doing. That is exactly the kind of initiatives we would like to see in other countries. So on your question, you know, what governments can do so that the policies are inclusive. So an obvious one is, of course, fiscal transfers or tax benefits to families with small children, because women predominantly take on childcare responsibilities and other forms of unpaid work, which is, as you know, especially burdensome in the COVID era. But then this brings me to my second point, and it's an important point that I touched earlier. So when it comes to government support for women, they really should have direct access to the infrastructure that is necessary to receive support during social distancing. So if a woman doesn't have a bank account or a mobile phone, what good would a stimulus check be to her? This is where digital finance can really help. So how can it help? One way that we are thinking about is the distribution of consumption vouchers through fintech platforms, which can be complemented by vouchers with income support measures tailored to women beneficiaries, as we just heard the case of Brazil. These benefits can be transferred directly, either through the bank or even a mobile money account. Let me just give you a few examples from around the world, and this was actually a study conducted by the UN. So, I had mentioned earlier the challenges, and what we are seeing also is that women who are facing violence or rejection by their own families in countries like Bosnia, Herzegovina, they've developed a plan to support civil society organizations which are running shelters. Colombia, Sweden have made resources available to support gender-based violence survivors. And then women who are the main providers of childcare, Argentina has increased monthly child allowance payments. And Australia and Costa Rica, interestingly, have ensured that childcare services remain open during lockdown. Australia, Cyprus, Italy have granted additional family leave to affected working parents. Canada, Spain, Korea have introduced cash benefits for parents for school and daycare, where they face school and daycare closures, for example. And then, of course, there are many women, as you know, they are the main source of livelihood. So in countries like Togo, Georgia, and Morocco, they are providing cash transfers or grants to women entrepreneurs and also informal traders. But we also know that many of these countries are very much fiscally constrained. And that's why, the IMF, as Carter very rightly pointed out, we really stepped up financing very fast. So far we have provided emergency financing to about 76 countries. And if you have other types of financing, about 81. There have been grants given for the poorest 29 countries. The G20 is calling for bilateral debt relief, as you know. Also, we've provided big liquidity support, policy advices to every country, and then capacity development, special things we've provided during this period to over 160 countries. So let me stop.
Okay, thanks, Ratna. Actually, both you and Fernanda touched on the importance of financial inclusion and financial literacy. I should use this opportunity to plug a report that OMPIP just released today. Actually, it's on financial inclusion in the Asia Pacific and how cloud computing is enabling that. So I'm going
Congratulations.
to... Thank you, Ratna. I'm going to switch over to Kautar now. So to change it up a little bit, in your line of work as an asset manager, maybe you can give us some perspective and tell us about how you are incorporating gender equality and diversity goals in ESG investing. What is your take on how this important topic of gender equality and diversity can be integrated in someone's investment activities or an institution's investment activities?
Sure. So I think that ESG is like the big fashion at the moment. So ESG for the members of the audience who are less aware is taking into account environmental, social, and governance factors in an investment strategy. And I think the spirit was to align the interests of investors and different stakeholders, either in the company or in the country or in the different asset classes in which the investment takes place. Now, I deal with sovereign debt, which means that my area of expertise is debt that is issued by governments and the public sector. And so as much as you can do a lot of things when, in my view, this is again my personal perspective, and I'm happy to debate with other panelists or members of the audience if they have a different view. As much as you can do a lot in terms of incentivizing or penalizing an issuer or a company when it is a private sector entity. So if you are the shareholder or a debt investor in a company, you can have very strict requirements, including in terms of gender diversity, for instance, representation of women on boards, and other such factors. I think that we have to be quite cautious when dealing with governments. I think that investors have to have a cautious and humble approach, if I may, in wanting to impose any priorities that they have on governments and penalize them if the governments do not have the same priorities. And it can be in terms of gender priorities, it can be in terms of environmental priorities, it can be not lending to a country because some investors assess that they don't do enough efforts on fighting deforestation, or I don't know. There are lots of debates around these issues currently. However, I think that there is space for incentivizing governments, so more the carrot approach than the stick approach. And in that spirit, you have seen the development of targeted instruments that can help governments who structure willingly and from their own choice, structure projects around these priorities. For instance, you have had the development of the green bond industry, including for governments recently. I think that the latest issuance was by Egypt was an interesting example in that space. And I think it's the same for gender, for a gender approach to these type of instruments. For instance, if a government decides to issue a bond that is focused on decreasing gender inequalities or addressing specific issues that women face, either on the education dimension or in the health dimension, and they structure it in a credible way, and they do it in accordance, for instance, with objectives of sustainable development goal. We have seen some issuance of SDG bonds, so-called SDG bonds, and investors want to contribute and want to lend money to the governments for financing these projects. I think this is a very interesting way to go. And I think that this is something that definitely will grow as an area of investment. The last thing I want to say is that I think there are some areas where investors can work with governments where they have aligned interests, and which will serve directly or indirectly the purpose of decreasing gender inequalities. For instance, there is a lot of work being done around improving transparency of national statistics. It includes fiscal data, monetary data, balance of payment data, often with the assistance from IMF, World Bank, and other international partners. And I think this is something that can be very important. Fernanda was mentioning earlier the importance of targeting some support to women who are most affected, or categories or minorities who are most affected by these type of shocks. We can't do it in a good way if we don't have the right statistics. How much women are more affected by men on unemployment, on poverty, on health or education. So we can see here that if a government makes efforts in improving its national statistics infrastructure and publish more reliable data, so it will serve the interests of the government, of investors, of women, of international organizations, of the civil society, and it can lead to a virtuous cycle. This is just an example. So this is just some observation, and I'm happy to take questions around this later on.
Thank you, Claudia. Fernanda, do you want to chime in?
Just want to add something to what Katwar just said, which I think is really important. The importance of having data, good data, to assess the challenges that we face. And we, because we started talking about COVID, I think the COVID experience so far, this is the greatest challenge, right? We do have a lot of policies in place, both from the fiscal side and monetary policy side. And these policies are such that, you know, some people are being able to keep their employment throughout this period because of these policies, in while we wait for the economies to reopen properly and or a vaccine to be in place. And this is all great, but the challenge is that we don't really know, or we really don't have the data behind to assess the damage, both for female and male workers, right? We really don't know what is behind these programs yet. And I think we are going to be able to see that, you know, once the programs are not in place anymore. But at this point, you know, we are seeing some statistics, but it doesn't really reflect the shadow effects that we have in our economies.
Yeah, and I think in COVID, during a pandemic, during a lockdown or quarantine situation, it's hard enough to collect data under normal circumstances, but even more challenging when there are limitations in physical movement, and so on and so forth. So very good points all around there. I'm going to turn now to Gina. You have done some work within Mazars, but also with other organizations in your network when it comes to supporting women in the financial community and promoting diversity there. So what can we learn from your experience there, and how can we connect that to all this discussion that we've been having around the pandemic and its effects?
Right. Thanks, Kat. Yeah, it's really interesting to hear, you know, from the public policy side, as well as from Qatar side with those ESG activities. Mazars has been in the forefront of doing business for good, and we've also been active in the ESG space as well as diversity as a strategy. We have developed solutions which we believe will help organizations gain insights into the state of their diversity efforts. So just to give a few examples of these solutions, we have the diversity and inclusion risk analysis tool. And this really assesses the risk areas at each stage of the employee life cycle. So from attraction to retention to promotion and exit. We also have the governance assessment tool, which analyzes different variables that's embedded in an organization's governance structure, right? So it talks about controls, the attitudes, and ways of how decisions are being made by the leadership team in an organization, which we also consider to be important. We also have the diversity predictive tool, and by the name itself, it predicts the future recruitment and promotion ratios of the company. And that's based off on the current as well as historical employee data and salary information. And also in this tool, it has an automated module that generates a gender pay gap report. So at Mazars, we try to develop solutions because we want to address the problem in the right way. And as Fernanda and Qatar mentioned earlier, data is very important. And hopefully, you know, we are able to provide information to these companies so they can make meaningful decisions as they address those diversity efforts that they're doing. Also in my neighborhood here in New York, the firm is actively involved, and we're supporting diversity and inclusion groups, not just internally, but also outside as well. So for instance, we are very active in our local state societies, the New York State Society and other societies that we have an office in. And we have someone from Mazars who is involved in those committees, specifically the Diversity and Inclusion Committee. We monitor their activities, we support their programs, and we send, we have our women attend those events. So as as an organization, we have a long way to go, just like I think everybody else, but we try our best to make progress along the way.
Thanks, Gina. And that segues into the next part of the discussion. So we've talked about wide-ranging solutions, what we can expect from the public sector and from governments, what investors can do, what community groups can do, what companies can do. The next part is I want to talk about our own specific organizations internally in your own firms or institutions. What are you doing, or what has worked in your view in terms of promoting gender equality, diversity, and inclusion? And this actually relates to a question that was asked by an audience member. So the audience member said, would love to hear from the panelists whether internal gender diversity within their organization is likely to lead to more gender inclusive policies and products. So basically, what are you doing in your organizations, and is it helping you craft more diverse or inclusive policies and products? Maybe we can start with Ratna.
Thanks, Kat. So, at the IMF, as you can imagine, it's traditionally been a very male-dominated and a white male-dominated institution for a very long period of time. And so about 2 decades ago, and I've been here forever, women started ground up fighting for greater equality. And I have to tell you that we did a lot of study, with data, empirical evidence, because that's what economists, that's how you can convince the economists, let's say. And we made some progress, but the real progress is coming when the top leadership sends the signal. So we've had now 2 female managing directors, and we've seen a lot of changes, in terms of promoting women, recruiting women, and increasing, diversity training, which has now become mandatory for us. So I think the way in which you can achieve diversity goals, we also have a diversity advisor in an office now, is you've got to work both from the top and the bottom. So, but we still have a long way to go. Right now, we are also working on race issues. I recently wrote an article on race and economics, and it was the first time that the IMF published anything on race. But coming back to the COVID crisis, so that's at a general level. What we have done is, again, very sympathetic top management, listening to the concerns, especially of women with small children. It affects both parents, for that matter. So we've become much more flexible in terms of providing for child care, both financially during this lockdown period, but also trying to find physical locations of daycare for them. So that's one. Maternity leave during this period has been extended, and this will likely stay beyond COVID. Of course, flexible work hours. Many of the departments are imposing breaks during the middle of the day. No meetings should be held. Another one is constant check-in from managers. We've got a lot of examples of virtual mission fatigue. In our job, we travel a lot, and that's very much a huge integral part of the work we do in order to be effective with the authorities in the member countries, to build traction, to build relationship. A lot of it is building relationship. You can't do it all virtually.
And Ratna, sorry to interrupt, but would you
Yeah.
say that having, you mentioned like the IMF has had 2 female managing directors recently. Would you say that having a diverse leadership team helps craft those more diversity conscious policies, if I should call them that?
Yes, and you know well, Kat, that the studies I've done cross country actually show that if you have more women at the top as CEOs, when we looked at financial firms, there were only 2% globally, which was shocking as CEOs. And then if we looked at the board of both bank boards, commercial bank boards, and regulatory authority boards, uh, you know, on average around the globe, there were less than 10% of women. And what we found is that if you increase diversity, increase the share of women, it actually helps uh, improve financial stability. A big goal of these. So that's pure
Something that's
evidence.
by the data. That's the research that you've done in your team at IMF. Is that we're going to run out of time soon, so I'm gonna try to make sure that we hear views from everyone. Fernanda, from the central bank's perspective, actually this is something that OMFIF has been doing research on. We did a survey earlier this year on what kind of diversity policies different central banks have. I'm very glad that the Central Bank of Brazil participated in that study. Could you give us some insight on what the central bank is doing? You've touched on some of them earlier, but perhaps maybe focus on the workplace and the work environment you have and how that's helping you in your work.
Of course, thank you. When you look at the employees of the Central Bank of Brazil, you see, economics is a very much male-dominated profession, and interestingly enough, this gender imbalance that you see in the profession is reflected almost perfectly in the gender imbalance that we have inside the Central Bank of Brazil. So if you look at some universities here in Brazil, you see that about 25-ish% of the master degrees in economics are given to women. And when you look at the statistics here inside the Central Bank of Brazil, you kind of see that same share of women as a workforce, but also at the different layers of leadership as well. So for the first time, for example, we have 2 women at the board at the Central Bank of Brazil, myself and my colleague Carolina. And so I think this has been a good development for the bank. But internally we are very much aware of the challenges that minorities face and women face in the profession, and we want to make sure that we provide an equitable and safe work environment for minorities in general. We have promoted, talking a little bit more about women in economics and how it works here at the central bank. We have promoted internally a series of workshops on harassment, discussions about gender problems and gender issues that may arrive in our profession. And as I mentioned before, we launched a new dimension in our strategic agenda inside the central bank, which is the sustainability agenda that has, not only climate related policies, but also policies related to mitigating social risks. And that goes straight into the conversation that we are having here. So this is a topic that we are very much aware of and very worried about, and working very much so to promote an equitable workplace in the Central Bank of Brazil.
Yeah, there are some very important points there. I mean, the ESG point about how when people talk about ESG, they quickly think about climate, but actually it's a whole range of issues and challenges that are under this wide umbrella. Kautar talked about some of those things earlier, but Fernanda also touched on another important aspect of work environment and workplace atmosphere, which is creating safe spaces for our teams, for our colleagues. And in the study that OMFIF did earlier this year, one of the things that we asked central banks was whether or not they have a set of guidelines, a codified set of policies around discrimination or around dealing with discrimination and harassment in the workplace. that is something that we've seen grow in importance, or it has always been important, but the attention has grown because of events that have happened in the last few years with the Me Too movement and other similar things that have happened. So I'm going to move over to Kautar. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what Barings is doing internally to support your female colleagues and making sure that our workplaces are inclusive and diverse.
Yes, it's tricky because I'm on the. I have a small hesitation to feel a bit indecent in answering the question. Why? Because I feel very privileged. You know, I have I work in an organization that has been doing a lot of work to support women for some time. We have a Barings Women's Network. We have panels on this. We have very good conditions in terms of maternity leave and child support. We have, you know, we can work remotely without it affecting, at least on my side, affecting much my ability to contribute to the team and to my job. And so it's, you know, it would be easy to say, it's good, look at me, we should all do that. It's a bit, it's uncomfortable, you know. You can look at me, say, oh, I am a woman, I am African, I am Arab, I am Muslim, I tend to be young. But on the other side, I am lucky to have the right degrees. I have a supportive, very supportive boss. I work in an organization that offers me a lot of resources, and so, you know, it's tricky. One thing that
I think the answer is in all of those. The answer is in all of those things that you're describing: supportive mentor, supportive programs within your institution. What would you say would be the most? What would you say would be, like, you know, as you progressed in your career, what would you say was the one most effective thing that helped you get to where you are? I know there are many, and you've touched on some of them, but what would you say would be the most important that perhaps, you know, people in our audience can learn from?
Yeah, sure. No, before that, I want to say something anecdotal that I think I appreciated a lot at Barings. I don't know if it's true in all Barings offices, so this is a disclaimer, but something anecdotal. I know that there are some colleagues, for instance, who are less able to do their jobs remotely. You have the assistants. When we don't travel as much, you know, they don't have travels to book or expenses or to process or these type of things. You have cleaning teams. You have people working at the reception in the offices who, for the most part, were closed for a long time. And I was very, you know, I felt very, I don't know, heartwarming for me to see that a lot of these people kept their jobs. And, you know, people at the reception or assistants are often women, you know, so this is something that I saw anecdotally among my colleagues that I appreciated a lot from Barings, and that adds on top of everything that is shinier and more fashionable about having, you know, all the support system or the mentoring, all the you know, the initiatives that are more visible. Related to your specific question, I think that I think one thing that helped me maybe is the fact that I never felt discriminated even inside my own family. And so sometimes, you know, I grew up in Morocco. You have the cliche view from outside that a African or an Arab or a Muslim country might be more conservative, or, you know, that there are more discrimination or prejudice against women. I have never felt or been treated differently in my own family, and I think it gives somebody a little bit more confidence, you know, to just go for the right degree or apply to the job that maybe you would auto-censor yourself from applying to or reaching for. And so that's something that helped, and I have no merit in that. My family, my parents, my brothers. I have 3 brothers. Interestingly, I don't have a sister. They have always been very supportive. I have very strong women in my family. Most of them are teachers, actually, very good educators. And so I think that that support system, even in the family, is very important. The support of your boss is very important. And I recognize what Ratna was saying earlier about having female leadership. In my own experience, I have already worked for men who have been very supportive to me and who have pushed me in my career. So I'm very grateful to that. And I think that these are very important. These are very important points. And related to the degrees that Fernanda was mentioning earlier, I want to ask if there are any students in the audience, or if you have organizations where you have interns. I mean, a number of alumni organizations from my universities that I attended that encourage, candidates from a different background, either geographical background or gender background, to apply. So please reach out if you have any questions or you need coaching to apply. And also we have a summer internship program at Barings, for which sometimes we don't have enough applications of quality, either from a gender perspective or from a geography perspective. So please apply either to the general Barings summer internship positions or to our own team's research fellowship. And if you have any questions, please let me know.
We'll make sure to pass on any applications we receive through OMFIF over to you. But thank you, Kautar. You make a very important point that sometimes, as with many things, it all starts at home. And if we have a supportive environment at home, that's something that the members of our household carry elsewhere. I'm just going to quickly go through another question from the audience before I ask our panelists for some of their parting thoughts. I'm conscious of time. I know we've gone over, but we also did start a little bit late, so please bear with us. I've gotten a go signal from the OMFIF team to extend a little bit. Something I will add, though, before asking the question is that indeed, it is very important to have support from management. The reason that OMFIF has been able to do events like this, discussions like this, research like this, is because it's support from male and female officials within the organization who have supported this project and the events that we do related to it. So the question from the audience is this: will COVID-19 lead to a generation of male-dominated jobs as firms are cutting on expenditure, cost, and overheads, which could mean displacing some female workers? I suppose that's a very broad question, and it could depend on the country, specific context, but this is something that maybe one of you can comment on, one or two of you can comment on. Is it something that you're observing within your own firm, perhaps, or in your wider community?
I think, I think, Kat, I think one of the things that we're seeing this time is that we are pretty focused on gender diversity, and we are now looking into more in-depth data in terms of the impact of this pandemic, between men and women. And hopefully with that information, we are able to target specific solutions. So that issue that men will have more opportunity in the future will hopefully likely not happen, and there will still be a continuous gender balance as we move towards that goal, because we've done a lot of progress throughout the past few years, and we risk losing that, especially in this situation. So I think with this discussion that we're having, our proactive outreach to different government groups, they will be able to focus on those. And I also just want to add on to what Kautar mentioned earlier, that she felt that she had that community and that support from her family, right? And that's great. And I think that's one of the things that we need to look into. What about those families that don't have that opportunity to belong in those kind of situations? What if those families don't have the necessary support? They don't have the resources. I think that's how IMF and government agencies can really focus into implementing certain programs that will help these young children, men and women, boys and girls, to have that opportunity, to have more education, to probably enroll in economics, because right now it's a very it's a male dominated degree. Those are areas where focus from people who can do something should be given to.
That's a really important point. Any other thoughts from our panelists on this specific idea? I mean, we touched on it earlier a little bit when we were talking about how there have been some job losses, disproportionately so for women. But as Gina pointed out, it's all about having the right information so that you can target mitigating mechanisms appropriately. So with that, I think I will now ask our panelists for some parting thoughts. I suppose as a closing question, could you please tell us about what you think is one important step that we can take to make sure that the recovery from the COVID-19 crisis is as equal as possible for men and women, and generally more inclusive for all? So perhaps we can start with Kautar.
It's difficult. I think that rather than opportunities, we can already start by limiting the damage. So, and try to not make it long lasting, and try to make it not compound into additional, problems and inequalities and discrimination. I think that the focus on education is very important because this is irreversible. I think that there were some studies which showed that if you lose a few months of education because of lack of access or inequalities of access to education, then that compounds, and it's very difficult to make it up later. And if that leads to more, again, school dropouts or different opportunities in the future, then it can have durable consequences. It's the same for the phenomena that Gina was mentioning earlier for the workforce, about risks for women to give up their jobs because they don't have an alternative or good enough support system. So I think that either individually or at our organizations level or at the policy level for some of us who have the ability to influence these policies, I think it's very important to keep that lens in mind and to try to get more information on it, more statistics on it, more precision on it, more data on it in order to understand it better and to work in a more durable way. Again, I started earlier by saying that this shock magnifies existing inequalities, and so I think that any work that has to be done on this has to be done in the longer term in order to be able to better withstand the next shock, because there will be next shocks, and to work towards more resilience in the future.
Thank you so much, Kautar. I am going to move over to Ratna. Any final thoughts? What do you think is the most important thing for a balanced recovery and equal recovery?
I have to say, Kat, that if you were asking me for one major thing that needs to be done by government, I would say it's to accelerate digital financial services. And this is because a recent study actually found that in most regions, gender gaps were closing with the advancement of fintech. And it wasn't true, it's not true everywhere. Asia and Western Hemisphere countries, the gaps in fintech were wider than in the other regions. So the governments need to accelerate digital services, but at the same time, they really need to have complementary policies to push digital and financial literacy, especially for women. Others have spoken about it, and increase the access for digital infrastructure. And finally, I want to say that there's also this huge challenge of chipping away at long-standing cultural barriers. And I tell you, I come from India, and it's been there forever. I mean, just to give you a very quick anecdote, as a young lecturer in a college in India, when I was even though I was financially independent, I still needed my father's signature to get a loan from a bank to study abroad because I was a woman. My brothers or others didn't need to do that. Only I did too. So these are really low-hanging fruits that can be completely eliminated. And the final thought is, what we've also found is that if you reduce gender gaps, overall economic growth increases across countries. So what that tells you is that it benefits all. There's an economic reason. It's not just a social or compassionate reason. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Ratna, and thank you once again for promoting OMFIF's newest report on financial inclusion. Please check out the OMFIF website if you'd like to look at it. Also check out Ratna's recent research on digital financial inclusion. I'm happy to send that. Just drop us an email on OMFIF, because indeed that is an important angle of an inclusive recovery. I'm gonna move on now to Gina. Some parting thoughts from you, perhaps the most important thing you'd like to highlight, important step you'd like to highlight.
Yeah, I'll make this quick, and I think this topic is very, dear to all of us here, women, and we can talk about this for hours, right? But just quickly, I think to the leaders in organizations, provide that opportunity for women to advance and lead. If it's not there, create it. It makes for good business, and it is the right thing to do. And to the individuals, to each one of us, I would say just seek out your peer support, build and empower that community, include everyone, including men, because we're all in this together. Thank you.
Yes, we might be all women in the panel today, but this is definitely not a conversation just for women. Men have to be part of the solution. And I know we do have plenty of men in the audience. I checked the attendee list before we started, and there are many of them here today, and I should thank them for joining and listening. I will give the final word to Deputy Governor Fernanda. Parting thoughts and most important thing you'd like to highlight.
Thank you, Kat. I think first, thank you for inviting me to participate on this panel. This has been great. I will approach your question from two perspectives, from an institutional perspective and then from a personal one. From the institutional side, I think what Ratna said is really important. I think we have an opportunity to include women and minorities in general with technology. And we have been trying to advance this in our institutional agenda, and we think this is key for a future that is more inclusive. So I think it's an opportunity in our hands. There is a lot of low-hanging fruit out there, and doing banking with our cell phones it's just so easy nowadays, right? So we can actually reach a lot more people now with technology, and we should take advantage of this. Now, from a personal perspective, you Kat asked what has been important in our lives in terms of developing at some point in this profession, and I think it's something that we need to do ourselves, is to look back and think about what helped us through our way. I'm pretty sure in this panel there has been people that had help from the family, people that had no support from our families whatsoever, but still we are in a very privileged positions in our institutions, right? And I think it's our duty to ourselves and the society to do the same. Think about what happened in our lives and was really important. In myself, for example, I think I had amazing mentorship throughout my career that was key for making me develop as an economist in a male-dominated world. And what I want to do is to give back and do the same to people around me, right? So I think this is our duty to help our profession to include women and promote a more inclusive work environment for women and other minorities. So I mean, it comes with the territory, basically.
Thank you, Fernanda, for closing on such an inspiring note. Indeed, I think all of us have benefited in one way or another from others opening opportunities for us and helping us as we progress. That's certainly been true for me, and indeed, it's important that we pay it forward. And one of the ways we're doing that is through this panel. It has been such a great privilege for me to have this discussion with all of you. So Fernanda, Ratna, Gina, Kautar, so wonderful for you to join us. Thank you for supporting this initiative of OMFIF. And to all our attendees today, thank you for bearing with us even as we went over time. And thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions about OMFIF's Gender Balance Index or the Sustainable Policy Institute or anything you want to throw over to our excellent panelists, please feel free to email research@omfif.org. I am going to wish everyone a good rest of your day. Please keep safe and healthy. And thank you again to all our panelists and all our attendees for joining us today.